They didn't knock. They came in force, at midnight, with a plan that had been weeks in the making, and a cruelty so calculated it almost looked like confidence. His mother went straight for one arm. He took the other. The woman he'd brought walked in behind them, holding the spare keys like a woman who had already decided which version of this story she was living in. She fought. Not passively, not quietly, she fought. And they dragged her anyway, across the floor of the home she had helped build and maintain and carry for 14 years, and dropped her in the cold driveway like something being discarded. The door closed behind them. Inside, arrangements were made. Arrangements were made. Outside, in the dark, her phone began to ring. But before any of that, before the midnight and the dragging and the door, you need to understand who she was. Because the only way to understand what she did next is to understand what they did first. And how long before that midnight, she had already decided what her answer was going to be. The day they buried her father, the hall smelled the way those halls always smell. Flowers and grief and something warm coming from the kitchen. Someone's recipe that had no written version, just hands that knew. It was the kind of gathering that holds people together by doing the small things right. Quiet voices. A hand on a shoulder. The particular grace of people who understand that presence is its own language. She had organized most of it herself. The caterer, the centerpieces. The program for the service, she'd been up past 2 a.m, the night before, making sure every detail honored the man her father had been. That was simply who she was. She carried things. Completely, quietly. Without making anyone watch her do it. Her name was Lenora Elaine Poot, 41 years old. She moved through rooms the way certain people do, not loudly, not with the need to take up space, but with a quality of presence that made you feel, if you watched her long enough, that she knew something she wasn't saying. Not arrogance. Something older and more deliberate than arrogance. The way some people carry knowledge, the way others carry grief close, private, protected, because they understand that the value of a thing is often in its concealment, until the moment is exactly right. Her husband Marcus was present the way a shadow is present. Technically, they're oriented correctly, saying the right things to the right uncles. But Lenora felt his distance the way you feel a draft from a window you can't quite locate. Not the cold itself, but the persistent wrongness of it. He kept stepping away to take calls. He kept angling his phone away from her when she came near. She noticed. She said nothing. That had become the pattern, her noticing, and choosing her moment, and waiting. His mother, Claudette, had spent 14 years constructing a very specific portrait of her daughter-in-law. She was the kind of woman who could make you feel diminished without ever raising her voice. Lips pressed into something that suggested a smile without committing. 2-1, eyes that assessed everything and found most of it insufficient. She moved through the repast hall like she was doing the room a favor by attending. She and Lenora had never been close. Which was the polite way to say that Claudette had decided long before that day that Lenora was not the right woman for her. Sonnen had spent 14 years building the evidentiary record to support that conclusion. Too independent. Too quiet. Too focused on her work. Not warm enough, not soft enough, not the shape of woman that fit the story Claudette had written for Marcus's life. Lenora had always known this. She had let Claudette build the case because she understood something about patient people. They can afford to let others talk. Because they know that talking is not the thing that decides anything. A woman named Desiree had been introduced as a colleague. She had no reason to be at a repast for a man she'd never met. But Marcus had brought her and offered no explanation. And the family had accepted her presence. The way families sometimes accept things that don't fully make sense by deciding not to look at them directly. Desiree was composed, carefully dressed, holding herself with the particular confidence of someone who already believed she knew how the story ended. She touched Marcus's arm once, briefly, when he came back from one of his calls. Just once. Just enough. Lenora saw it from across the room. She set down the cup she was holding, so her hands would be empty. Marcus pulled her aside, not far enough. The hallway near the restrooms, 3 of her cousins at a table 10 feet away. He spoke in the low, practiced tone of a man who had rehearsed this, who had selected this specific moment, possibly because he believed her grief would make her less capable of fighting back. Possibly because he simply hadn't thought it through that deeply, which would have been its own category of cruelty. He told her he wanted a divorce, that he'd been unhappy for years, that he'd already spoken to an attorney. He delivered it in the flattened voice of someone reading from a document they hadn't authored. As though the words were happening to him rather than coming from him, Lenora looked at him without rage and without tears. She looked at him the way you look at something you have already accounted for in your calculations. One of her cousins had gone quiet. She could feel the social weather of the room changing. That particular shift, when people realize they are witnessing something they're not supposed to see and cannot look away from. She felt Claudette's gaze from across the hall. Not surprised. Not surprised at all. Which meant Claudette had known this was coming. Which meant this had been coordinated. At her father's repast, on the day they put Eldon Pewd in the ground, something moved through her chest. Not anger, not yet. Something quieter and more devastating than anger. The specific pain of understanding that the people who were supposed to be your family had looked at your grief and seen an opening. That they had chosen this particular day, this particular occasion, on purpose. Her hands wanted to shake. She made them stop. She looked at Marcus one last time and said, quietly and without hurry, "You should have waited until Monday." He blinked. She could see him searching the words for meaning and finding nothing. He assumed she meant emotionally that she needed more time, more distance from the funeral. He filed it as something wounded and moved on. He had no idea what Monday actually meant. He had no idea what was already done. She walked to the parking lot, stood under a sky full of stars that had no opinion about any of this. From the outside, anyone watching would have seen a woman alone on the worst day of her life. Publicly cut by the man she'd built a life with, standing in a parking lot with no clear direction. It looked like an ending. That was fine. She drove home alone. The house felt wrong, the way places feel wrong when you already know you're leaving them. Now before we go further, you need to understand who Lenora was before any of this happened. Not who she became. Who she already was, long before any of them forced the door open. Because the story that Marcus and Claudette had been building and polishing for years, the story they had distributed through the family and believed themselves, was that she was cold, closed off, too wrapped up in work to be a real partner, too self-sufficient to be a real wife. And the cruelty of that story is the way it erases everything that came before it. The way it removes from the record the woman she actually was and what she actually gave. Her father, Eldon Pewd, was a man of specific and quiet greatness. He worked in commercial real estate for 30 years, not at the top, not in the large office with the large deals, but as the man who understood the land itself, who read surveys and contracts and market cycles with the patience of someone who believed the ground was communicating, if you were willing to sit still long enough to hear it. He raised Lenora alone after her mother died when Lenora was 9 years old. He raised her with books in early mornings and the particular discipline of a man who understood that the world would not be fair to his daughter. so he had to make sure she was more prepared than the world expected her to be. He used to spread documents across the kitchen table, contracts, property assessments, zoning maps, and walk her through them, not as lessons exactly, but as conversations. The way other fathers talk through baseball statistics or chord progressions, he would say, "Lenora, the person who understands the paperwork always outlasts the person who makes the noise." She heard it enough times that it stopped being a saying and became something structural. Something built into how she moved through the world. She grew up understanding that patience was not passivity. That silence was not weakness. That the most powerful position available was the one nobody knew you held. She had loved Marcus. That deserves to be said plainly, without softening or rushing past it. She had genuinely, fully loved that man. There was a time in their marriage, a decade in, when he would call her his quiet force and mean it as the highest compliment he knew how to offer. When he would come home from a bad day and she would already know. She would always somehow already know. And dinner would be ready, and the music would be low, and she would simply sit beside him and not require anything while he found his way back to himself. She supported him through 2 failed business ventures without a single word of reproach. When the first company collapsed, she reorganized their finances quietly and took on additional consulting work, and never once made him feel diminished by the rescue. When the second failed, she did the same. She had loved him with the steady, undramatic commitment of a woman who understood that real partnership means showing up most completely when showing up costs the most. At some point, the warmth between them had cooled. She couldn't name the exact moment, because there was no exact moment. It was adrift. The slow accumulation of his mother's voice getting louder in his ear. Slowly reshaping how he saw his wife, reframing Lenora's strength as a threat rather than a gift. His own ego, which had taken real damage from those 2 failures. Finding it easier to resent her competence than to be enlarged by it. And during all of those years of drift and diminishment and slow cooling, while Claudette was building her case, and Marcus was retreating into a story about himself that required Lenora to be the problem. Lenora had been building something. Quietly, carefully, the way her father had taught her. Not in secret, not in spite, not as a contingency plan for a marriage she'd given up on. She built it because building was what she knew how to do. And because some part of her, the part that never lied to her, understood that she needed something of her own. Something solid. Something with only her name on it. 4 days after the funeral, they came at midnight. She heard the car first, then voices Marcus, low and directing. Claudette, clipped and efficient. And a third voice, she recognized immediately. She had time to stand up from the couch before they knocked. She opened the door, and there they all were just as planned. Marcus with his jaw set and his eyes not quite landing on hers. Claudette already moving past her into the hallway with the proprietary certainty of a woman who had been mentally redecorating this space for years. Desiree slightly behind, not gloating but present, watching. Holding herself at a careful distance from what she was participating in. The boxes were already packed. That was the detail that landed hardest. Because it meant this had been arranged before, he taught her. Before the repast, before the hallway, before the rehearsed delivery. What she had witnessed at her father's funeral had not been Marcus working up the courage to finally say something hard. It had been Marcus executing step 1 of a plan that had already been in motion for weeks. Claudette moved through the space with the specific efficiency of a woman living out a long-imagined scene. She directed, she touched surfaces as she passed them, she navigated around Leonora as though Leonora were furniture awaiting removal rather than the person who had lived there. She did not speak to Leonora directly. Marcus watched Leonora gather her things, her father's leather portfolio, her personal documents, 2 changes of clothes. He watched her, and something moved across his face that he couldn't contain. She was too calm, too unhurried. He had expected something from her. Tears. Confrontation. The kind of demonstrative pain that would confirm for him that he held the power in this situation. Instead, he was watching a woman move through her own home with complete composure, making her choices without rushing, treating the selection of what to carry as though she had already thought about it at length and had already decided. He almost said something. His mouth opened slightly and then closed. He didn't know what he would have said, so he said nothing. But her calm followed him out of the room in a way he couldn't name and didn't want to examine. Examination would have required questions he wasn't ready to answer. Desiree had believed Marcus severe. That is the essential thing to understand about her. She was not a woman who had set out to wreck a marriage. She had met him at a professional event 8 months earlier. And he had described Lenora as someone who had emotionally vacated their marriage years ago, who had chosen her career over their life together, who had made him feel invisible inside his own home. Desiree had heard the story of a lonely man in a marriage that had already ended in every way that mattered. And she had believed it, because he told it with conviction, and because she had no reason yet to question the narrator. But standing at the edge of that midnight removal, watching the woman she had been told was absent and checked out, moving through this house with deliberate calm, she felt something she had not anticipated, unease, because the woman she was watching didn't look like someone who had emotionally left. She looked like someone absorbing a controlled demolition of her life and choosing, moment by moment, not to perform the pain of it. That distinction settled in Desiree uncomfortably, wordlessly, and she filed it away because there was nothing else she could do with it yet. The apartment Lenora moved into was small and spare, and she held the word temporary in her mind, like a compass point, not because she was in denial, but because she needed to know which direction she was facing. Her friend Ren came the first night with food, and sat on the floor with her, because there was only one chair, and they both agreed. The floor was fine. Ren was the kind of friend who showed up without being asked, which is the rarest category of person. And having her in those first days made the walls feel less like they were pressing in. Claudette, meanwhile, was working a version of events. Through the family, the way skilled people work a room methodically, leaving no table unvisited, seating the account with just enough reluctance to seem trustworthy. Lenora had always been difficult, too focused on herself. Marcus had given 14 years and received distance in return. Sad, really? Sometimes, these things just don't work out. She delivered it with the specific sorrow of someone who hates to share bad news, which made people receive it as truth before Lenora could offer any alternative. That was the design. The story hardened quickly. Lenora's attorney called the week. After the removal, Marcus's legal team had entered discussions with a clear number in mind, a settlement figure based on what he believed they had built together, what he believed the asset picture looked like. His certainty about that picture was absolute, and it was wrong. Her attorney had communicated that there were assets pending disclosure tied to an upcoming corporate announcement. Marcus's attorney had passed this to Marcus. Marcus had called it attacked it. He knew his wife. He knew what she had. He was certain. He was not certain. He had simply been looking at the wrong things for so long that he had confused familiarity with knowledge. There was a birthday dinner for Marcus's nephew, a 9-year-old named Curtis, who had nothing to do with any of this adult wreckage, and who had invited her himself weeks before everything collapsed because she always brought the right gift and always played with him like she meant it. She had promised him she'd come. She kept her promises to children. She showed up, stood at the door, asked for Curtis, crouched down when he appeared and gave him his gift, and told him she loved him and happy birthday. Claudette materialized in the hallway behind the boy and, in front of everyone seated at the dinner table, said it was bold of Lenora to attend a family event she no longer had any part in. Said it with that pleasant poison she had spent a lifetime perfecting, the kind that sounds almost reasonable until you feel where it lands. Lenora stood up slowly. The urge to answer rose in her fully, to say every true thing out loud. To tell everyone at that table exactly what day Marcus had chosen to deliver his announcement, whose repast it had been, what hour they had come. To her door, all of it pressed against the back of her teeth. She closed her mouth. She looked at Curtis. Told him she'd see him soon. Walked back to her car, and sat in the parking lot for a long time, without going anywhere. That night, alone, in the apartment, she finally came apart. Not loudly, that was never how Lenora broke. She broke the way deep things break, slowly and from the inside. With no audience, and no performance, because there was no one there to perform for. She sat on the floor, with her father's portfolio in her lap, and she cried in that voiceless way that means the grief has been waiting longer than the current moment. Angie's roots, older than what just happened. She cried for her father. She cried for the marriage, which had been dying longer than she'd allowed herself to acknowledge. She cried for the girl at the kitchen table who had been told that patience would always be enough, that doing things correctly would eventually be seen. She cried because she was human and had loved and had been humiliated, and was sitting on the floor of a temporary apartment at 41 years old, and it was not supposed to look like this. She held the portfolio closed on her lap. She didn't open it that night. She just held it. Ren called the next morning, already knowing about the birthday dinner. She was angry in the way that real friends get angry, fully, on your behalf, without requiring you to manage their feelings about it. But after a few minutes, she said something that came from genuine love and genuine worry, which was that maybe Lenora should think about settling, taking what was fair, starting over somewhere clean. I just don't want to watch you fight this for 2 years, Ren said, and lose yourself in it. The words landed with real weight because they came from care, and some part of Lenora, the tired part, the part that had been carrying everything for so long, heard them and felt the pull of it. The smaller exit, the quicker ending, the chance to just put it down. There was a silence on that call long enough for Ren to ask if she was still there. Lenora said yes. Said she'd think about it. Said nothing else. She sat in that silence for a day and a half? Then she opened the portfolio. Eldon Pute had held a piece of commercial property in a neighborhood that had once been written off as too far gone, and was now one of the most strategically positioned parcels in a rapidly developing corridor of the city. He had purchased it for almost nothing in the 90s. He had held it through every economic cycle. Every developer who had called him foolish, every year that people drove past and saw an old building rather than a foundation. He had held it because he read the land. Because he was patient. Because he understood that value does not announce itself, it arrives, eventually, for the people who waited. He left it to Lenora in his will, and she had known for years it was coming because he had told her about it himself. At that kitchen table, in the voice he used for everything that mattered. And when he told her, she had already been 4 years into something she had been building quietly and correctly and entirely in her own name. A holding company structured with her attorneys and a financial architect, who had worked with her father and trusted her judgment completely. She had acquired properties, studied markets, cultivated relationships with international development groups that were looking for American commercial real estate with specific characteristics. She had done it slowly. She had done it legally, documented and above board and fully disclosed. She had simply done it without advertising it. Because Lenora Pute had been raised to let the paperwork speak, her father's property was the anchor, the cornerstone of a 3-city commercial development project she had been assembling for 4 years. The partner was an international firm with the capital and the vision for exactly what she and her team had built. The total projected value of the completed deal, $10 billion. She had signed the final closing documents the afternoon of her father's repast. 3 hours before the guests arrived, she had sat in a lawyer's office and put her name on the most significant transaction of her professional life. Then she had driven to the hall and arranged the centerpieces and greeted the cousins and accepted the condolences and watched Marcus take phone calls in the corner and felt Claudette's cool assessment from across the room and stood in that hallway and heard her husband announce the end of their marriage in a low, rehearsed voice. And she had looked at him and said, "You should have waited until Monday." Because Monday was when the press conference had originally been scheduled. He humiliated her before the world found out who she was. He burned the house down 12 hours before the deed revealed that she owned the entire street. The press conference was held Thursday when the venue opened sooner. The hotel ballroom filled with people who worked in commercial development and real estate investment and urban planning. People who understood immediately what the scale of the announcement meant. Marcus had received an invitation through his firm. A subsidiary project had listed his contracting company among several vendors. 18 months prior, a mid-level contract his team had completed without him ever pausing to examine who sat at the organizational top. He came expecting a professional milestone, a validation, and he brought Desiree because he wanted her there for it. He was relaxed when he sat down. He did not stay relaxed. Lenora entered through a side door, not the main entrance. No particular timing, no dramatic framing. She simply came in from the side and walked to the presenting table and took her seat. Dark, structured clothing. The expression of someone who was precisely where they had planned to be. Nobody in that ballroom knew her face. But when the MC stepped to the podium and her full professional name was read into a microphone in front of 400 people, the floor shifted beneath Marcus in a way that had nothing to do with the building's foundation. The MC described the project: 3 cities, 3 major development corridors, $10 billion in projected value, 4 years in the building. Described the lead architect and majority silent partner. Described how the deal's anchor traced to a strategically held commercial parcel whose ownership ran back decades. Described a silent partner who was stepping into full public professional visibility for the first time in connection with this project, who had been quietly assembling the asset base that made all of it possible while serving simultaneously in advisory roles that no one in that room had connected to this larger enterprise until today. Lenora's name appeared on the screen behind the podium. For the development professionals in that room, it was a confirmation. For Marcus, it was a door falling off its hinges. He sat very still. Desiree was beside him and turned to look at his face when the name appeared on screen. What she saw was not embarrassment and not anger, it was the expression of a man who had just understood that every measurement he had been using was wrong. That the map he had been navigating by did not describe the territory at all. She had told herself this woman was absent from her own life, emotionally checked out, more committed to work than to her marriage. What she was looking at now was a woman who had been more present, more focused, more intentional than anyone in her vicinity had understood. The presence had simply been directed toward something none of them had known to look for. Desiree picked up her bag. She stood quietly, without a word, and moved toward the exit. Marcus didn't watch her go. He was still looking at the screen. Lenora answered questions from the press with the composure of someone who had been preparing for that room for 4 years. She spoke about the development vision, about the communities the project would shape, about her father. About Eldon Pute, who had held a piece of land for 30 years because he believed in ridding the ground and waiting and trusting that what is built correctly will outlast everything constructed on noise. She said his name once into the microphone, and her voice stayed level. The room felt it. People who had never heard of Lenora Pute before that afternoon would remember her after it. She did not say Marcus's name. Not once. She did not look in his direction. She didn't need to. The press conference was not about him. It had never been about him. And that was the most devastating thing she could have done, and she understood it without having to think about it. Marcus sat in the ballroom long after it emptied. He sat with the stillness of a man doing a long and painful accounting. 14 years beside her. 2 failed ventures she had propped up without reproach. 2 financial reorganizations she had quietly executed. 4 years of building she had done in plain sight, in the same life they shared, alongside the dinners and the slow cooling, and the drift, and he had never seen it. He had looked at her every day, and assembled a story about who she was, a story shaped by his mother's voice and his own wounded pride, and his need to believe that the competence differential ran in his direction. The story had been wrong from the beginning. He had evicted a woman from her own life the night before the world discovered who she was. He had chosen the repast of the man who built her to announce that he was done with her. He had done all of it based on a misread that was now irreversible and public and permanent. He drove home alone. In the weeks that followed, things unwound the way things do when the foundation was always wrong. Not dramatically, not in a single collapse, but gradually, with the grinding quality of consequence that does not announce its arrival, but simply settles in and stays. His vendor relationship with the development firm concluded quietly, not retaliation. Simply a new organizational structure with different partnerships and different needs. His professional network, which overlapped more significantly with Lenora's world than he had ever paused to understand, began to see him through a different lens. Not contempt exactly, a quiet reassessment, which in some ways was harder to absorb than contempt. Invitations slowed. Calls took longer to be returned. The texture of his professional life thinned in ways he couldn't identify directly but could feel accumulating against him. Claudette's world contracted too. One of Lenora's cousins had been in that repast hall, had heard Marcus in that hallway, had known what day it was and what occasion it was when he chose to say those words. That cousin spoke to someone in the church community that Claudette valued above almost everything else in her social life. And the account of what had been done spread the way truth tends to spread in close communities, not as scandal. Not loudly, but as information that quietly revises how people see you when you enter a room. Certain women who had always greeted Claudette warmly, now greeted her carefully, which is a different thing entirely. And Claudette, who had spent a lifetime building social architecture, recognized when some of it was being quietly taken apart, reached out through Lenora's assistant 6 weeks after the press conference. Not an apology, more an acknowledgement. A communication that said, in measured words, that she understood she had been given an incomplete picture. That certain things had been framed in ways she had accepted without sufficient examination. Lenora's assistant received the message. Lenora never responded. That silence was a complete sentence. It said everything it needed to say, without costing Lenora a single thing. Which was precisely how she preferred to spend her energy at this point in her life. There was a morning about 2 months after the press conference, when Lenora drove back to the property, her father's property, which was no longer just her father's property, which was now the cornerstone of something that had already begun reshaping the ground around it. She parked and stood on the sidewalk in front of it, in the early quiet, the hour that belongs only to people who are up before the world starts making noise. Ren pulled up behind her 10 minutes later. She hadn't said she was coming. She had simply known, the way she always seemed to know, and she brought 2 coffees, and stood close enough that their arms nearly touched. That was the whole apology for telling Lenora to settle. Lenora accepted it completely, because she understood that Ren had said it from love and from worry, which is different from saying it from a belief that Lenora wasn't capable. Those are not the same thing, and Lenora had always known the difference. She thought about her father. Not about Marcus, about Eldon Pute, and a kitchen table, and a document spread across it. And a patient voice explaining that the ground tells you something if you're willing to listen. She thought about what it actually costs to wait. Not patience as an abstract virtue. Not patience as the inspirational poster version of itself. Patience as an active, daily, sometimes very expensive discipline, practiced in the faith that what is built correctly will eventually reveal itself. She thought about the repast hall and the parking lot and the midnight and the apartment floor and the birthday dinner and Ren's phone call and every moment in between when it would have been so human, so understandable, so forgivable to break open. To perform the pain. To answer every accusation. To let them see that they had gotten to her. She was glad she hadn't. Not because silence made her superior to anyone. Because silence had kept her strategy intact. And her strategy had built something real. And something real was the only answer that was ever going to be enough. Any speech she could have given would have been temporary. Any confrontation would have given them something to point at. Something to reframe. A way to reduce her to a character in someone else's story about who she was. The paperwork told the story she wanted told. The paperwork didn't exaggerate or perform or need to be defended. It simply stated what was true, clearly, without apology, and let the truth do the work. Some people look at silence and decide it means weakness. Let them. Silence is just strategy, wearing patience as its face. The woman who knows what she's worth does not need to announce it. She builds it correctly, and she waits, and she lets the documentation speak. Lenora took a long sip of her coffee. Ren said something about the light hitting the building in a particular way. Lenora agreed that it looked good. And it did in the early morning, in the honest light. With construction already beginning to shape the space that would become something lasting. The thing her father had held onto for 30 years. The thing she had built toward for. It looked exactly like what it was, a foundation, solid, correctly made. Built to outlast everything that had ever tried to be louder than it. If this story moved something in you, if you know what it feels like to be underestimated by the people who are supposed to know you best, hit like, drop a comment, and share this with someone who needs to hear it today. Subscribe, because we tell these stories for the ones who stayed quiet and kept building anyway.